Hey guys, this is Eric Weingarten with Weingarten Racing. Today's video is the other factors that are involved in head porting. And I'm doing this video because a week ago I put out this video that I'm not as good as what you think, and I put out this video about this head that I'm porting for a customer that's going to be digitized and all that. And several of you said, you're just chasing CFM, you're just chasing CFM, and you didn't know what else went into it. And then the other was like, it's just CSA. It's just CSA. That's all. Once you got the CSA, that's all you need. That's all. CSA, once you got it, you should know what it flows. Bam, you're done. And then others like, it's velocity, 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 velocity. And that's what it should be. Well, because of that, I was like, I really need to do a different video. And I'm encouraging you to do this. Please watch as much of the video as you possibly can and do not fast forward. And the reason for this is this. I know human nature, people just ignore about half of what you say, because half of what people commented were what they heard from really truly experts, but they only heard a small part of what they said. It's kind of like when I'm talking to my wife, she hears one part, but not the whole part, and then we get confused. I think some of you do that. Human nature does it with everything. So I think there's several great head porters that have told you stuff, but you heard one of this essence, one part of it, but not the whole thing. So please try to make your way through this whole video. You will learn something, I promise. So, and I'll try to justify why it's that way. There is not one thing that makes this the most important thing. And I know you're like, well, you watch your videos and all you do is post CFM stuff. That's not true. I also give you measurements and stuff. And you're like, what about velocity? Well, if you know CFM and you know the sizes, you know what the velocity is going to be. And I really am trying to get further understanding on this, because I promise you it's just not one or two factors. It is so many. It literally is like a lottery ticket where there's a bunch of different numbers and any one of them could be wrong and you're not winning. So let's get to it. The three ones that most people talk about are CFM, velocity, and minimum CSA. Those are the three major ones that everybody seems to talk about, and it's extremely important on all of them. The thing is, most of you are like, well, it's the most important is minimum CSA. No, the most important is velocity. And the most important is CFM. They're not, okay? And it can vary by head. And let me explain. If you've got an engine that's requiring, say, 400 CFM, and you've only given it 300 CFM, and all you did was raise the CFM because you're so under what the air it actually needs, it doesn't matter what these other two are. The more CFM you made, it just makes more power because it's so under what it's asking for. Then it looks like the CFM is the most important. But what happens like on a head like this, these LS3s, where it already flows more than what the engine's asking for. So if we look at demand of the engine, in case you wondered for that, there's several calculations online. You can look it up. I've used an app from Stan Weiss, and that's one I've been using forever. But if you could calculate your CFM by how much the RPM is and the bore and stroke of your engine, essentially cubic inch and RPM. That will tell you what your minimum CSA is. And from that, you can determine the velocity. But let's say you have a head like this, an LS3 style, it flows, 370 CFM. Most 400s, 408s, LS guys, even 427s, and you're on street stuff, is not demanding 370 CFM. They're demanding much less. So you've already got more than you need for CFM. So having more CFM than what you need, if you gain 10 CFM, you may not even see 5 horsepower difference, because in that case, it's already flowing enough air for what it needs. Then these two other factors become more important. So then it's velocity. Since we already know the port's big on LS's 3s, if I can get the velocity up for the RPM range it should make more. But that's not always the case, because then what you can have is, what if it's got the right CFM? The velocity looks good on the bench, because that's the other thing. These benches, you can velocity probe it, and that's one thing. We're like, oh, throughout the entire port, because I heard that several times in this video. Did you velocity probe it? Yeah. On the bench, it looks perfect. You could have it exactly perfect in all your spots. The live engines, the velocities are not the same as what my pitot tube shows. So in a live engine, the velocities might look great on the bench, but because the minimum CSA is so small, it will never achieve the RPM it needs, so it doesn't look so good. And in that case, minimum CSA looks great. So it's not just one thing. If one thing's so far off, it makes that one look really important. If the others are close, then it makes something else look important. They are all crucially important. Crucially. But when you just focus on those three, you're missing so much of the picture. You've got 3 lottery numbers. You don't have the whole thing, not even close. So what I did is I listed some other factors that I include in how good a head should be, or what I should do as far as porting. These are the other things. So everybody talks about these because these are the easy ones to talk with. I can measure on the flow bench. I can measure CSA and show you, and I can calculate velocity from those two. These ones are the other things that make things important. So these are important. This is other stuff I've come up with. So the biggest one, and I don't show videos on it because it's something I try to keep to myself, is the one thing of all the development stuff I'm working on is probably shape. And what I mean by that is there are shapes inside the port, specifically over the short side radius, the apex of it, where I try different shapes to maintain it with the same CSA. So I'm trying to keep, I know what CSA it needs at the short side, but what shape would work best for that head? That's probably the best thing, because you're right. Your calculations say you've got the minimum CSA you need. Absolutely. But the shape can be drastically different and alter the power. So that shape is super, super important as well. But most people only talk about this. What CSA, what shape can I get for that CSA? That's a huge difference. And here's what I mean. So I drew some rough pictures to kind of show you. So let's pretend this is the looking down the short side, which I don't know how well you can even see this. I'm going to show you my crappy one, this one. If you can see it right over the apex, you'll get an idea what I'm talking about. Anyway, it's right over there. If you porters look at this, and you can just see, I don't know how to describe it besides we're looking at an image that's in there and you're seeing a shape, but it's almost impossible. If you look at the apex of the short side, I picture all the way around, this is what shape it should be. If you're a non-porter, this is gonna go right over your head because you have to see that. But that shape can change. It can be any one of these or multiples of others. So what if it's truly oval? Well, that's great if we can maintain that same CSA, but sometimes there's water. What about square? Because remember, you had the right minimum CSA. Which one do you think makes more power? That perfectly square minimum CSA that has, and I say minimum CSA, just CSA we'll say, that has that shape or that shape? They have the same. Which one makes more power? You see why those aren't only the factors? Then what about this one where you've got, it's bulged over this type, it's closed off the top? Because if you look at your velocity probe, ain't much happening there anyway. What about this one where you got a little bit more underneath and a little bit up the top? What if I slope it down in one corner? What if I dig it down in the center, just dip it, and then it's the same this way? Or what if I just do one side that's dipped down? There are so many different shapes that can get you the same CSA, and one of those, or maybe two of them, can be fantastic, and several of them can be turds. That's why shape's important. Then we have this one. What about CSA difference? You talked about CSA. We got to have the minimum CSA because you got to have certain size for certain RPM return. But what if they're like one of these pictures? So what if you got this case scenario? So you've got such a, by the way, these are picture of port drawing. So I'm cut open the head to this way and picture they're drawn this way. This one you've got really short CSA right here. Minimum CSA is really small, but then we got so much big here. Well, obviously it looks horrible. This one looks like it's a great one. It's almost straight all the way through, except for if you were to do this, you'd realize that over the short side right here, that velocity gets really fast here, and it wants to ramp that short side, and that one not always best. So then what about this? It's kind of like the LS3 here. Huge! Where the pushrod pinch would be, and it narrows down. You're like, well, that looks fantastic. It gets really tight there. Well, what about the small block Chevy one? Here we have a huge, or I shouldn't say huge, we have a bigger minimum CSA here, gets tighter and then bigger. That CSA difference, it's another factor. Most don't talk about it. You're just like, well, you need a certain CSA. That's what you need. And that's cross-sectional area, in case you're wondering. I should have brought that up. But you're like, that's the most important. Well, what if it's not? What if you only targeted this one, but the other ones were different? Well, what if it was a dramatic change? You went from correct size to huge to small or anything else. Those being different changes the power because that air does not like to speed up, slow down, speed up. It doesn't do that. It doesn't not like that. Fuel hates it for sure. So there's a lot of things with the difference in CSA that makes a difference. And that's where the other thing with shape comes in. How can I alter these shapes throughout the port where the CSA is exactly where I want it to be, but it doesn't change as much, keeping the air attached to the port without jumping the short side or something else. Another important factor, not mentioned in those three. Then there's this, valve size. I've talked about this before. The valve size plays a huge difference in power production, where you can have a bigger valve actually make more power. And I know somebody like, you got to have your coefficient of discharge. That goes back to CFM too. What if I have a 202 valve that moves like 270 CFM, and then I put in a 208 valve and it moves 280? Well, that's only 10 CFM worse. Its coefficient of discharge, or how much air it's moving through that area, looks worse. But if the engine wanted 280 CFM, which one do you think made more power? You get the idea? Also, what if your cam limited size? Like if you only got a 530, having more area with the valve open, that's more curtain area. See, there's a lot of things there. This one you cannot control, its valve location. If you're a head porter, you can't be like, I'm just gonna move the valve spacing over. I mean, in theory you can, it's just a lot of work. So in essence, what you could do is you could poke out the guide, put aluminum slug in, re-drill your holes, put the guide through, and do all that. That's a lot of work, and most don't do it. But even as a head porter, I do know, what I can do is I can look for a head that's got a valve spacing that I want, where the valve might be off the bore more than others. And that's the head I want to start with because it looks like it's going to have more potential. So you can't alter it, but you could pick your ones. What about seat angles? It's not mentioned in this, but seat angles are huge. I mean, what if I altered and put a 55-degree seat in this versus a 45? 55 is going to look outstanding at the upper lifts. It's going to look like crap down low. But does that actually make more power or less power? That's not mentioned in those. It's important. Then this is the next one. Through all of this, most people look at this, they're only really thinking of the intake side. What about the exhaust? The poor fella gets left behind. That exhaust is the initial pull on the intake charge. So if you're doing things wrong on the exhaust, it actually hurts the intake flow as well. Because during overlap, the first pull that comes on the intake charge is not the piston moving down. It actually happens during overlap. That's when the exhaust and the intake valve open at the same time. The air leaving will actually, through the exhaust port, will start to pull the intake charge in. That's the initial pull, and it's actually relatively strong. So that part's extremely critical. It's why cam timing is so important. But that's also related to exhaust. If you make the exhaust port, say, too big, well, how does that affect that pull on the intake charge? It's not mentioned in those, but it's super important. And last thing, and there's many things, by the way, I didn't mention just because I'm going to save myself on a time here on this video, is chamber shape. This one's not too bad, but I have seen where you've got a perfect port design. So the cross sections all the way through are great, the shape through there is great, and then you've got a crappy chamber. If you want to know what I'm talking about, why don't you look at a 440 Mopar head, for instance. Granted, they may not have the best design, but I have done that 440 source head. Its port really doesn't look that bad. And then you get to the chamber, you're like, ugh. It just comes off flat. There's no divergent cone. It's just a bunch of open space, has little quench area. You just killed it. So it doesn't really matter what happened through here. Had the right CFM, right velocity, right minimum CSA. Turd chamber. Most people just forget that stuff because you only heard those three things said by most people. If you listen to the rest of what the professionals say, other things come up that are also important. And it's not that I'm the only one. I hate when videos do that. Like, I'm going to tell you head porting secrets that no one else talks about. That's lies. They've talked about them, you just didn't hear them. I'm not doing that. But I'm telling you, these are some more stuff that's important. And I probably could make a list that goes on and on and on of other things that are important with it. Spark plug location. What about wet flow? Where does the fuel puddle? The port height itself, like how far up it is so I can get a straight line of shot instead of having to do like small block Chevy, this stupid thing we have to do. And you're like, LS guys are like, I ain't got to worry about that. No, you've got a situation like this where you're like way too big and then too small. So there's a lot of stuff that's important besides just those three. Although these are important, Here's your part of your lottery ticket. Get them all right, you win. If you only focus on one, you just got the Powerball number. You got $3 or whatever it is now. I think it pays like $6 maybe. That's it. You ain't getting it all. You ain't winning. So hopefully you got something out of this video today. And remember, I'm not, and as the last video said, I am not as good as you guys, some of you think. Some of you think I am the God guru, and then the other half of you think you are an idiot. And I would say I'm probably leaning more towards the idiot side. But what I'm trying to say is, this is just stuff. I'm just giving you opinions. If you want to be a good head porter, you will listen to me. You will listen to every other person you can. And you're going to figure out what works and what doesn't. Don't take one person's word as gospel, even mine. Because I promise you, maybe in a year, 5 years, 2 years, I'm going to learn some more stuff that I thought, man, this is really right. And it turns out to be wrong. You want an example? I got a perfect one. It's sitting right there. See that Victor Jr.? Nowhere in my head porting mind did I ever think this would beat so many other things on the dyno mule. And it keeps doing it. So there are things that are learned through testing that prove some of my stuff not to be as correct. But I know this, so far getting these right has made winners. You guys take care, and remember, I'm no Superman.